Foxhole is one of those rare games where every bullet, every tank, and every bunker is built by the players. But with a game this massive, balancing can be a challenge. With over 80 vehicles and more than 50 weapons, finding the right middle ground for things like damage, fire rate, and cost for the equipment makes balancing things very difficult. What players need to understand right away is that balance changes in Foxhole don't just tweak the numbers, they can reshape the course of an entire war. That's why today I want to talk about where balance in Foxhole stands, what feels strong, what feels weak, and how all of it affects the way we fight. For those unfamiliar with Foxhole, it's a massive multiplayer war game where thousands of players fight across a persistent map 24/7, in wars that can last for weeks and sometimes even months. Some players focus on logistics and production, others on engineering and building, while many others dive into the chaos of frontline combat. In Foxhole, balance exists within an asymmetric environment, which means players are not fighting on equal ground with mirrored weapons or vehicles. They are working with completely different pieces of equipment across the two factions. This asymmetry, both between the two factions and across a variety of roles, creates incredible depth, but it also makes balance uniquely difficult. And this raises the question, who exactly is the game balanced for? Infantry players, tank crews, logi players, facility builders? Every role interacts with balance differently, and making adjustments for one can ripple out and negatively affect another. Buffing artillery might help frontline assaults but frustrate builders. Adjusting resource costs might slow down tank production, and inadvertently discourage players from engaging and crafting them, which means less on the front lines. The challenge the devs have is to maintain balance across all of these roles, without breaking the ecosystem that makes Foxhole so compelling. This is what one developer, Max, had to say about the balance in Foxhole. There are many different kinds of game design, which is why it is such a bottleneck. Our game is immensely complicated. There is design that is user-facing, like balance, and design that's more technical. I don't think there's anyone on the team, short of Mark himself, who knows the complete depth of the changes that will come out of the pipeline as a result of one tiny change. And I'm not talking about technical debt either. There's no game out there like Foxhole where we can draw inspiration from when it comes to things like logistics. End quote. Balance in any multiplayer game is about making sure every option feels meaningful. Nothing should be so weak that it becomes pointless to use, and nothing should be so strong that it completely dominates the battlefield. Foxhole, like many multiplayer games, is built around asymmetry, which frustrates a lot of players. The Colonials and Wardens simply don't fight with the same equipment painted different colors. They use completely different vehicles and weapons. A Colonial battle tank doesn't mirror a Warden battle tank. Each has its own quirks, strengths, and weaknesses. That asymmetry is part of what makes Foxhole interesting, but it also makes balance a much harder target to hit. Foxhole long ago used to be a symmetrical game, where both factions had the same vehicles and weapons, but over time the devs wanted each faction to be more unique. This is what one developer said about their decision to make the game asymmetrical, because it's cool. Symmetric weapons were boring. Balanced, but boring. That's just my opinion. End quote. One of the longest running balance debates in Foxhole centers around two infantry weapons, the Colonial's Lunaire and the Warden's Cutler. Both are powerful in their own right, capable of tearing through bunker bases, especially when those defenses are left unmanned. For years, players on both sides have argued about whether these weapons are too strong, and no solution has fully satisfied either faction. But the question should be asked, are Lunaires and Cutlers really decisive enough to swing the outcome of an entire war? Personally, I don't think so. Foxhole operates on too large a scale for a single piece of infantry equipment to dictate victory. In my opinion, wars are won through logistics, coordination, population, and morale, not by any one weapon alone. This is what the developer Max had to say about this. You know what the icing on the cake is? Balance in vehicles and weapons is really only a small part of balance in the game. Games like StarCraft can focus on tournaments between pros. In our game, we have to worry about population balance, map balance, experienced player balance. So many factors could be playing into one side dominating another that it's not so easy to just point out one thing and say, that's the thing that is broken and needs to be nerfed. End quote. Wars in Foxhole can last weeks, sometimes even months. These wars aren't quick 30-minute matches where you can instantly test whether something feels overtuned. Instead, we have massive economies, supply chains, and thousands of players all interacting with the balance at once over a long period of time. A single tweak like changing the range of artillery or adjusting the fuel economy of tanks can ripple across an entire war. I don't think the developers can simply adjust weapon values like damage or cost on a whim during a war. If one faction ends up with an overtuned vehicle or weapon, the other side grows frustrated enough to just stop playing altogether, and with wars lasting weeks at a time, that could mean players don't return until the next one. On top of that issue, Siege Camp is a small studio, which makes perfect balance almost impossible to achieve on the first try. Whenever a new update drops, the following war often ends up serving as a testing ground for those changes. Balance tweaks usually don't settle in until after the war is over, when the devs can look back and adjust based on what actually happened in live play. This is what Max had to say on getting testing feedback. "We're sure we're not going to strike perfect balance with these weapons on the first pass. We're really counting on player feedback to make them worth it without making them OP." End quote. This is why the balance in Foxhole looks so different compared to big studios. Riot Games, for example, pushes out League of Legends balance patches every 2 weeks, which is supported by endless match data. Siege Camp, on the other hand, has to work with just a handful of wars each year. If they overshoot on a change, players might spend 30 days slogging through a miserable meta before the next patch fixes it. A good example of this happened during the Great Silo War of War 115. Players discovered that silos could be built cheaply and spammed across the battlefield, effectively blocking the opposing faction from advancing. Because the developers couldn't patch it out mid-war, everyone had to endure the situation until the conflict ran its course. Once the war finally ended, the devs stepped in and made the right adjustments to prevent it from happening again. But as I mentioned earlier, balance changes like this just don't affect the front lines. They create ripple effects that impact the backline as well. The Logi players became frustrated with the changes made to the silos as a result. Beyond the stats, balance can also be psychological. In Foxhole, perception often matters as much as reality. If players believe a Warden tank is unkillable, or that Collies have better rifles, they'll start repeating those claims until they spread across the community, even if the actual numbers say otherwise. This is why many players dismiss balance discussions as nothing more than propaganda. The perception is that some people push for changes not to improve the game as a whole, but simply to give their faction an edge. I've seen plenty of bad faith arguments over the years, often fueled by deep faction loyalism rather than objective reasoning. Many players have never switched sides or experienced the game from the other perspective, yet they still call for sweeping balance changes. Only a small number of players approach the conversation from a neutral standpoint, normally with first-hand experience of both factions and solid reasoning for why adjustments might actually be necessary. So how do developers approach balance in such a complex environment? One of the most important tools when developing balance is to have trade-offs. Almost every piece of equipment in Foxhole has a cost attached, sometimes literally in resources or sometimes in usability. A heavy tank may deal devastating damage, but it may take forever to build and can be crippled easily by sticky grenades. Meanwhile, an armored car is cheap and fast, but melts the second it faces any anti-tank weapons. These trade-offs give players meaningful choices, forcing them to weigh risk and reward every time they roll out of the garage. The next thing the developers consider when talking about balance is what we call counters. In most games, this gets simplified into a neat rock, paper, scissors loop, but Foxhole doesn't let it stay that simple. Sure, anti-tank rifles counter vehicles, and artillery counters bunkers, but each counter comes with its own logistical and tactical challenges. A field gun might stop tanks, but it needs crew, ammo, and protection. Infantry can use sticky bombs, but only if they get close enough to throw them. This web of counters creates dozens of overlapping minigames across the battlefield, and in my opinion, it's what makes Foxhole's warfare feel so alive. I think we are pretty lucky in the Foxhole community to have devs that are constantly listening to their player base, though they may not roll out patches as fast as we want them to. One of the developers, Markfoot, had this to say about listening to the community. "I read that thread earlier today. We're working on balance changes today. The type of changes we can make before the next war is limited. We're figuring it out now." End quote. And this is what the developer Max had to say on the same topic as well. "We do. When it comes to vehicles and weapons, we try our best to keep them balanced between factions, despite many concerns to the contrary. All I meant to say is that it's never easy to see the problem clearly, though we do read your messages, Reddit posts, and watch videos to try our best to understand the problem from the player perspective." End quote. Looking at the bigger picture, the results of Foxhole's wars show just how hard balance is to measure. At the time of this video, the Wardens have won 65 wars, and the Colonials have won 61. This looks close on paper, but even those numbers don't tell the whole story. Things like population swings, map layout, morale, and even time zones all play massive roles in determining victory. And how can a dev balance any of those factors? Players need to realize that balance in Foxhole isn't just about the equipment stats. It's about how those tools interact with the human element as well. Now personally, I don't worry too much about the tiny details. I've seen players get hung up on whether one rifle reloads a fraction of a second faster, or whether a tank has slightly better armor. For me, the bigger question is, does the balance allow for epic battles? Do wars flow across the map with both sides having a chance to create memorable moments? That's what matters to me. One example I talk about with new players sometimes is that many vehicles in Foxhole are situational and are only useful in niche scenarios. And honestly, that's fine. Not everything needs to be perfectly equal. The real goal of balance, I think, isn't mathematical perfection. It's making sure the game stays fun, dynamic, and unpredictable. In the 4 years I've played Foxhole, I've only seen a handful of situations where something was truly overpowered. One example that immediately comes to mind was when the Wardens first received the Silverhand Lodescar tank. Its initial damage output was absolutely brutal. It was capable of wiping out colonial tank lines with alarming speed. I usually don't care about small balance details, but this was one case that simply couldn't be ignored. Everyone knew it was overtuned, and sure enough, the very next war the developers adjusted it. Another example was back when large groups would roam the seas on longhooks armed with anti-tank rifles. They used these rifles to snipe down large ships with ease. That tactic felt completely broken, and at least for me, it drained a lot of the fun out of naval combat. Thankfully, that was also patched out quickly once the issue became clear. In the end, balance in Foxhole is about more than numbers. It's about creating a battlefield where players feel like their contributions matter, whether they're hauling supplies, building a fortress, or leading a charge. It's about ensuring that no single piece of equipment decides the fate of a war, but that every role has a chance to shine. And it's about keeping the game fresh without losing sight of what makes it fun. So now I'll turn the question over to you. What are your thoughts on balance in Foxhole? If you were a developer, how would you go about making changes to keep the game fair, fun, and engaging for everyone? Let me know in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching and for your support. Make sure to subscribe for more Foxhole content. I'll see you out on the battlefield. Cheers.